The heavy oak doors of the banquet hall groaned open, spilling a wave of golden candlelight and the suffocating scent of roasted meats and expensive perfume into the dim corridor. Lady Seraphina Vance stood in the shadows just beyond the threshold, her fingers gripping the rough stone wall so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The muffled strains of a string quartet drifted out, playing a lively waltz that felt like a mockery against the pounding in her ears. This was the Duke's midsummer banquet, the very same banquet where, 3 years, her life had been irrevocably shattered. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, but her body felt frozen, trapped in a nightmare that had long since ended. In her mind, she was no longer the poised, elegant daughter of House Vance. She was a broken woman lying on a bed of silk and regret, listening to the dying breaths of her husband, Lord Julian. The memory washed over her, as vivid and agonizing as the day it happened. Julian had been pale, his skin translucent like parchment, his once vigorous frame reduced to a hollow shell by a wasting sickness. The grand bedchamber had been stiflingly hot, yet he had shivered beneath a mountain of furs. Seraphina had sat by his side for 3 days and 3 nights, holding his wasting hand, whispering prayers and promises of a love that had been entirely one-sided. Julian, she had whispered, her voice hoarse from weeping, I am here, I will always be here. He had turned his head slowly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He hadn't looked at her, he had looked past her, toward the door where her younger half-sister, Ella Ra, stood weeping into a lace handkerchief. Julian had rasped, his voice a dry rattle. He had squeezed Seraphina's hand, not in affection but in desperate urgency. My dearest Sera, I promise anything, she had sobbed, believing, in her infinite foolishness, that his final thoughts were of their life together. Weary me, Ella Ra, he had breathed, the words slipping out like a final, damning confession. Not in the family crypt, beside her, in the Vance plot. She is the true love of my life. You were merely the duty. The silence that had followed was louder than any scream. Seraphina had sat there, her heart stopping in her chest, as the truth uncoiled in her mind like a venomous serpent. All those years of devotion, of managing his estates, of nursing him through his illnesses, of enduring his coldness and his absences, it had all been for nothing. She was not his wife, she was his guardian, and her sister, the sweet, demure Ella Ra, who had always played the role of the concerned sibling, had been his secret he. The betrayal did not come from Julian alone. The true knife in her back had been twisted by her own blood. She remembered the night before Julian's death, when she had confronted Ella Ra in the Jaraden. Her sister's mask had slipped so easily, the tearful innocence replaced by a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. You really believed he loved you, didn't you, sister? Ella Ra had whispered, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. Father always said you were the sensible one, the useful one, but Julian only ever wanted me. Even when he married you, it was father's doing, to secure the alliance, but his heart, his soul, that was always mine. And her father, the Earl of Vance, had known. He had orchestrated the entire union, using Seraphina as a political pawn to bind the powerful Thorne family to their own, all while secretly allowing Julian and Ella Ra to see a eye on their affair under the very roof of her marital home. Her own family had sold her happiness, her dignity, and her life, for a seat at the high table. Back in the bedchamber, Julian's grip had finally gone slack. His eyes had remained fixed on Ella Ra, who had rushed to the bedside, her tears now mourning the man she had truly loved. Seraphina had been pushed aside, a ghost in her own tragedy. As her sister claimed the final moments of the man who had been her entire world, she had died 3 months later, not of a broken hair, as the poets would have it, but of a broken spirit. She had simply ceased to eat, ceased to speak, ceased to be. The physicians called it melancholia. Seraphina knew it for what it was, the final, merciful release from a life that had never been hers to begin with. A sudden, sharp intake of breath tore through her throat. Seraphina's eyes flew open. She was not in the corridor. She was not in the bedchamber. She was standing in the center of the grand ballroom, the golden light of 1,000 candles reflecting off the polished marble floor. The music was at its crescendo, the air thick with laughter and the clinking of crystal goblets. She looked down at her hands. They were smooth, unblemished, and trembling. She was wearing the emerald silk gown she had worn on that fateful night 3 years ago, the night Julian had publicly toasted to the enduring bond between our houses, his eyes lingering on Ella Ra across the room. The night she had smiled and played the part of the blissful bride, blind to the vipers nesting in her own home. Seraphina, the voice was smooth, and laced with a practiced affection that now made her stomach churn. She turned slowly. Lord Julian Thorne stood before her, resplendent in his midnight blue velvet coat, a silver goblet of wine in his hand. His handsome face was arranged in a mask of adoring devotion, his dark eyes shining with a double that she now knew was a masterful performance. "You seem distant, my love," he murmured, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to gently tuck a stray curl behind her ear. His touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like the caress of a spider. "Is the music too loud? Shall we step onto the terrace?" Behind him, Ella Rematir, her expression a perfect portrait of sisterly concern. She wore a gown of soft lavender, deliberately chosen to complement Serafina's emerald, a subtle reminder of her place as the second Arai. "Sarah?" Ella Ra asked, her voice a melodic whisper. She reached out, her fingers brushing Serafina's arm, in a gesture that was meant to appear supportive but felt like a brand. "You've been so quiet all evening, perhaps you should sit down. You know how delicate your constitution can be." The old Serafina would have melted at their concern. She would have leaned into Julian's touch, grateful for his attentiveness. She would have thanked Ella Ra for her kindness, blind to the condescension in her tone. But the woman standing before them was no longer that girl. Serafina looked from Julian's expectant face to Ella Ra's feigned worry. She saw the micro-expressions they thought were hidden. The slight tightening of Julian's jaw as he waited for her to perform her role. The flicker of impatience in Ella Ra's eyes as she calculated how best to manage this minor inconvenience. They were waiting for her to smile, to nod, to be the perfect, grateful wife and sister. A cold, crystalline clarity settled over her, as sharp and cleansing as winter frost. The grief, the despair, the crushing weight of her past life's pain. It did not vanish, it crystallized, it forged itself into something hard and unbreakable within her chest. She was back, she was alive, and she remembered everything. Serafina met Julian's gaze, and for the first time in 3 years, she truly saw, not the husband she had loved, but the architect of her destruction. She looked at Ella Ra and saw not a sister, but the thief who had stolen her life. She did not smile, she did not speak, she simply held Julian's gaze, her own eyes as still and deep as a frozen lake, reflecting the candlelight but offering no wrath. The silence stretched, a single, taut thread in the cacophony of the ballroom. Julian's smile faltered, just a fraction. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. This was not the script, this was not the adoring wife he knew. Ella Ra's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Serafina's arm, her nails digging in slightly. "Sarah," she prompted, her voice strained. Serafina slowly, deliberately, withdrew her arm from Ella Ra's grasp. The movement was smooth, unhurried, and final. She looked back at Julian, her expression unreadable, her silence a fortress. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tiaras. She would not give them the comfort of her forgiveness. This time, she would not be the victim. This time, she would be the storm. And as the music swelled around her, Serafina Vance smiled. It was a small, private curve of her lips that did not reach her eyes, a promise whispered to the universe. The game had begun anew, and this time, she knew all the rules. The silence between them stretched, taut as a bowstring. Julian's smile remained fixed, but his eyes had gone flat, the warmth draining from them like water from a cracked vessel. He was recalculating. The man who had spent 3 years reading her every sigh and glance as an open book was suddenly confronted with a locked door. Ella Ra's fingers tightened on Serafina's arm again. A subtle, desperate pressure. "Sarah. Da Rowling. You're frightening me," she murmured, her voice pitched perfectly for the Niarba guests to hear. A concerned sister, worried for her fragile sibling. "Perhaps some air. The heat in here is quite oppressive." Serafina finally moved. She did not pull away. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping over Ella Ra's face with the detached appraisal one might give a stranger's ill-fitting gown. The lack of recognition in her eyes was more devastating than any slap. Ella Ra's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary sound of shock. "The air is indeed heavy," Serafina agreed, her voice soft, melodic, and utterly devoid of emotion. She lifted her free hand and gently, deliberate, pried Ella Ra's fingers from her arm. The gesture was not violent, but it was absolute. She held Ella Ra's gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, allowing her sister to feel the chill of that empty stare, before releasing her completely. Ella Ra's hand fell to her side, her knuckles white. A flush of genuine confusion and anger crept up her neck, visible even in the golden light. She had expected tears, or perhaps a fainting spell. She had not expected to be dismissed. Julian recovered first. His social instincts, honed by years of political maneuvering, overrode his personal bewilderment. "Of course," he said smoothly, gesturing toward the terrace doors. "A moment of respite would do us all good. Shall I escort you?" He offered his arm, the picture of devoted husbandly concern. It was a test, a way to reassert control, to see if her silence was a momentary lapse or a deliberate challenge. Serafina looked at his proffered arm. In her past life, she would have taken it gratefully, leaning into his strength, believing his touch was an anchor. Now, it looked like a shackle. No, thank you, Julian, she said, her tone light, almost. I believe I will enjoy the night air alone. The view from the eastern balcony is radical raleigh lovely this time of year, is it not? The eastern balcony, the very spot where, in her previous life, she had stood weeping while Julian and Ella Roche read their first stolen kiss in the shadows below. He had told her he was speaking with a steward about estate matters. She had believed him. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes flickered to Olara, a silent communication passing between them. I insist, he said, his voice dropping to a persuasive murmur meant only for her. It is unseemly for a lady to wander the terraces alone at night. Unseemly, Serafina echoed, tasting the word. She turned to face him fully, her expression serene. How thoughtful of you to be concerned with propriety. But I assure you, I am quite capable of managing my own safety. Besides, she added, her gaze drifting meaningfully toward Ara, who was still standing frozen. I would not want to deprive my sister of your company. She seems quite unsettled. It was a masterful stroke. She had used Ilara's own performance of concern as a weapon, framing her refusal as an act of sisterly consideration. To object further would be to expose his own discomfort. Julian was trapped. His smile was now a brittle mask. As you managed, his voice strained. Serafina offered a small, polite nod to them both. Ruel, not an invitation, and turned. She walked toward the terrace doors, her spine straight, her steps measured and silent. She could feel their eyes on her back, twin beams of suspicion and dawning panic. The cool night air was a balm against her skin. She moved to the stone balustrade of the eastern balcony, the familiar landscape of the Girodans stretching out below, bathed in silver moonlight. The scent of night blooming jasmine was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes inside. She was not here for the view. From her vantage point, she had a clear line of sight to a secluded alcove beneath the terrace, rashly hidden by a trellis of climbing roses. In her path, she had discovered this place by accident months after this very banquet, finding a discarded ribbon that smelled of Ella Ra's lavender water. It had been the first tangible proof of her husband's infidelity. A clue she had been too naive to understand at the time. She waited, her breathing slow and even, her body still as a statue in the shadows. Patience was a virtue she had learned in death. Less than 5 minutes later, the terrace doors opened again. Soft footsteps approached, hushed and furtive. Serafina did not move. She remained hidden in the deeper shadow of a stone pillar. 2 figures emerged into the moonlight below. Anara, they were being watched. Julian Elara. He took her hands, his posture urgent, his voice a low, angry hiss that ride on the still night air. What was that? What did you say to her? Alala Ra's voice was a tremulous whisper. I don't know, Julian. She looked at me as if I were a stranger. And she mentioned the eastern balcony. She couldn't possibly. She knows something. Julian cut in, his voice tight with fear, or she suspects. If she goes to her father, she won't, Ilara insisted. Though her voice lacked conviction, she's too soft, too trusting. It was just a momentary pique. She'll come around. She is not the woman we knew. Julian murmured, staring up toward the keen balcony where Serafina stood. Unseen, his eyes scanned the shadows, but he did not see her. Something has changed in her eyes. Akola Ra shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. What do we do? Julian's expression eroded. The devoted husband vanished, replaced by the calculating politician. We proceed with caution, but we must also prep. If she becomes a liability, we will have to find another way to secure the Vance assets. Her brother Thomas, is far more amenable to persuasion. Serafina's blood ran cold, but her mind burned with a fierce fire. Thomas, her younger brother, the heir. In her past life, he had died in a hunting accident 2 years after this banquet. An accident she had always suspected, but never been able to prove. Now, she had confirmation. They were already planning his demise. They were not just unfaithful, they were murderers. She watched as Julian pulled Ella Ra into a desperate embrace. Their lips meeting in a kiss that was no longer passionate, but panicked, a kiss between co-conspirators. Serafina did not look away. She memorized every detail. The angle of Julian's hand on Ella Ra's waist, the specific tremor in Ella Ra's voice, the exact words spoke. She filed it all away. Each piece a brick in the fortress of her revenge. When they finally rotted and slipped back inside, she remained on the balcony for a long time, letting the chills seep into her bones. The pain of her past life was still there, a deep abiding ache, but it was no longer a wound, it was fuel. She had come to this banquet 3 years ago as a bride, blind and trusting. She had left it as a widow, broken and betrayed. She would leave it as something else entirely. A player. She turned from the balustrade and walked back toward the light and music of the ballroom. Her face was a mask of serene composure, but her eyes held the quiet, devastating certainty of a storm that had already broken. Julian and Ella were waiting for her inside, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of polite concern. They expected her to return, chastened and compliant. They were wrong. As she crossed the threshold, Seraphina Vance did not see her husband or her sister. She saw her, and the hunt had only just begun. The transition from the silent terrace back into the suffocating earth of the ballroom felt like stepping into a gilded cage. The string quartet was still playing, the champagne still flowing, but to Seraphina, the entire scene had been stripped of its illusion. The glittering chandeliers were no longer symbols of high society, they were the bars of a prison, and the smiling faces around her were not peers, but accomplices. She moved through the crowd, her emerald silk gown whispering against the polished marble floor. Heads turned as she passed. Whispers trailed in her wake like a comet's tail. They had sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, inexplicable change in the Duke's perfect bride. Whispers were the currency of this world, and tonight, Seraphina intended to bankrupt them. Julian was waiting for her near the grand staircase, his posture rigid. Ella stood beside him, her lavender gown a deliberate echo of submission. When Seraphina approached, Julian's eyes watched her face, desperate for a crack in her porcelain composure. "My love," Julian said, his voice a masterclass in forced tenderness. He reached for her hand, his fingers seeking to reclaim the dominance he had lost on the terrace. "You've been gone so long, I was beginning to worry." Seraphina allowed him to take her hand, but she did not return the pressure. Her skin was cold, her grip limp. She let him hold it like a dead thing. "The night air is bracing," she replied, her voice pitched perfectly for the eavesdropping nobility nearby. "It clear as the mind. One begins to see things with such remarkable clarity when the fog of complacency lifts." Julian's thumb stroked her knuckles, a nervous repetitive motion. "You speak in riddles tonight, Sira." She tilted her head, her gaze drifting lazily to Ella. "I was merely reflecting on the beauty of this estate. It is a shame that such magnificent foundations are often built upon shifting sands. One must always inspect the bedrock before trusting the structure." Ella's breath hitched. The metaphor was a velvet-wrapped blade, aimed directly at the secret they had just read in the Girodin. Ella's eyes darted to Julian, panic flashing in their depths. Before Julian could formulate a recovery, a new presence materialized at the edge of their circle. The air seemed to drop in temperature. "See." The voice was a rich, baritone that commanded immediate silence. Standing before them was Prince Kalen. He was dressed in immaculate black velvet, the silver crest of the royal house gleaming at his throat. His face was a study in aristocratic indifference, but his piercing eyes were fixed entirely on Seraphina. In her path, Seraphina had brilliantly spoken to the prince. He had been a distant, brooding figure, exiled to the northern borders shortly after this very banquet due to a fabricated treason charge orchestrated by Julian. She had mourned his exile, an array that his removal was the final piece of Julian's consolidation of power. Now looking at him, she saw not the distant royal, but the only man in this room who possessed the strength to break Julian's game. He was the wolf they had locked out of the castle, and he had just found the key. "Your Highness," Julian said, bowing deeply, his panic instantly replaced by the sycophantic deference of a politician. "We were just admiring the gardens." Lady Seraphina was expressing her appreciation for the estate. "Indeed," Kalen murmured. He did not look at Julian, his gaze remained locked on Seraphina, heavy with an unspoken weight. Lady Seraphina has always possessed a profound appreciation for truth, has she not, even when it is? Seraphina met his gaze. There was no deception in his eyes, only a sharp assessing intelligence. He had heard the tension in her voice, the deliberate double meanings. He was testing her, seeing if the sudden steel in her spine was real. "Truth is a heavy burden, Your Highness," Seraphina replied softly, holding his. "But it is the only foundation upon which anything of value can be built. Illusions, no matter how beautiful, eventually crumble." A slow, dangerous smile touched the corner of Kalen's mouth. It was a smile of recognition. "A profound philosophy, my lady. I trust you will not lose sight of it." "I intend to hold on to it with my life, Your Highness," she vowed, the words carrying a weight that made Julian shift uncomfortably. The prince gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, an alliance forged in the space of 3 sentences. He turned his attention to Julian, his expression owing to glacial politeness. Julian, I require a word regarding the northern gay resin. It was a dismissal, absolute and public. Julian's face flushed with a mixture of anger and impotent rage. He could not refuse a direct command from the crown. Of course, your highness, Julian managed. His jaw clenched, he turned to Seraphina, his eyes burning with a silent yawning. Excuse me my love, duty calls. I would expect nothing less, Seraphina replied sweetly. As Julian followed the prince away, Ella was left standing alone with Seraphina. The younger sister's facade of demure innocence was beginning to fracture. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss that only Seraphina could hear. What are you playing at, Seraphina? Flirting with the prince in front of your husband? Have you lost your mind? Seraphina turned to face her sister. She did not raise her voice. She did not show anger. She simply looked at Ella with the same detached pity one might offer a rabid dog. I am merely playing the role of the dutiful wife. Ella, Seraphina whispered back, her lips barely moving, ensuring Julian's alliance is secure. Surely you understand the importance of securing one's position. You have been working so hard to secure yours. Ra paled, her eyes widening in horror. You couldn't possibly, could I not? Seraphina's smile was a ghost of a thing. BCA refull, little sister, the eastern balcony is quite drafty tonight. It would be a tragedy if you were to catch a chill. Or worse, if someone were to overhear your private conversations. She let the threat hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ra took a step back, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. The predator had become the prey, and she knew it. Seraphina did not wait for a response. She turned and glided back into the crowd, leaving her sister trembling in the shadows. She had struck the first blow. Julian was his attention diverted by the prince. Ella writhed, her confidence shaken to its core. But Seraphina knew this was only the opening move. Julian was cunning, and a cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. He would not back down, he would escalate. As she reached the refreshment table, a servant approached, ring a silver tray. On it rested a single, sealed envelope. The wax bore the crest of House Vance, her father's seal. Seraphina's heart gave a single, painful thud. She took the letter, her fingers steady as she broke the seal. She unfolded the parchment, her eyes scanning the familiar, elegant script. My dearest Seraphina, I have received word from Julian's steward regarding the eastern estates. There are discrepancies in the ledgers. I require you to return to Vance Manor immediately upon the conclusion of the banquet. We must discuss the management of your dowry. It seems your husband's ambitions require a recalibration of your assets. Do not fail me. Your brother Thomas is already proving inadequate, and I will not have my legacy compromised by your husband's greed. Father, Seraphina stay read at the letter, the parchment crinkling slightly in her grip. The betrayal was so casual, so bureaucratic. Her father was not asking if she was happy, he was not asking if she was safe. He was demanding she hand over her remaining leverage to protect his own investments, even as his son-in-law plotted to murder her brother. The grief that had been held at bay by her rage suddenly threatened to break through. Her father, the man who had taught her to ride, to read, to manage accounts. The man who had looked at her not as a daughter, but as a ledger to be balanced. She closed her eyes, taking a slow, shuddering breath. When she opened them, the TARs had been burned away by a fire that would consume them all. She folded the letter and slipped it into the hidden pocket of her gown. They wanted her assets, they wanted her compliance. She would give them exactly what they deserved. Seraphina looked up, her gaze finding Julian across the crowded ballroom. He was speaking with the prince, his head bowed in forced deference, but his eyes flicked up, meeting hers. In his, she saw the dawning realization that the game had changed. She offered him a small, serene smile. It was the smile of a woman who had already won. Even if the rest of the world had not yet realized the battle had begun, the night was young, and the reckoning was just getting started. The ride back to Vance Manor was a blur of cobblestones and shadows, but Seraphina's mind was razor sharp. The letter from her father burned against her ribs, a physical manifestation of the cage she had been born into. In her past life, she had read that letter and wept. Rushing to her father's study to beg for his approval, handing over her dowry deeds with trembling hands to prove her worth. She had been a dutiful daughter, right up until the moment they threw her away. Not this. The manor was dark when they arrived, save for the single, flickering candle in her father's study. Seraphina dismissed her maids with a quiet, unyielding authority that left them blinking in confusion. She did not go to her bedchamber. She walked straight to the heavy oak door of her father's domain and pushed it open without knocking. Earl Vance sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber brandy in his hand. He looked up, his expression a mixture of irritation and impatience. He did not offer her a seat. He did not ask how her evening had been. "You are late, Seraphina," he stated, his voice as dry as the parchment on his desk, "and you look pale. I trust you have brought the transfer documents for the Eastern estates as I requested in my note." Seraphina closed the door softly behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. She walked to the desk, her emerald silk gown rustling, and stood before him. She did not pull out any documents. She simply rested her hands on the polished wood, leaning forward slightly. "I did not bring them, father," she said, her voice smooth and steady. The Earl's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through his aristocratic indifference. "Ardon, did you not read my letter? Julian Stewart has already informed me of the discrepancies. The estate is bleeding coin. As my daughter, it is your duty to plug the hole with your dowry. It is what you were married for." "I am weary of my hereditary duties," Father Seraphina replied, her gaze locking onto his. "But I am also weary of my own. The Eastern estates are not bleeding coin. They are highly profitable. The discrepancies Julian Stewart reported are fabrications, designed to siphon funds into his own private accounts to finance his extracurricular pursuits." The Earl stared at her. The brandy glass halted halfway to his lips. "Extracurricular pursuit? You speak treason against your husband in your father's house." "I speak truth, father, something you have always claimed to value above all else." Seraphina's voice did not waver. "You asked for my dowry to secure our family's legacy, but you are refunding a man who is actively plotting to dismantle it, and you are willing to sacrifice my brother Thomas to do it." At the mention of Thomas, the Earl's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Thomas is a fool. He lacks the discipline to manage the northern trade routes. Julian has offered a far more stable arrangement. Julian has offered you a viper." Seraphina countered, her tone dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "Thomas is not a fool, Fath, he is loyal. Something you have never demanded of Julian. And something you have never received from me until tonight." She reached into the hidden pocket of her gown, and withdrew the Earl's letter. She laid it flat on the desk between them. "I will not sign over my assets to a man who intends to murder my brother." She read, the words ringing with absolute finality. "If you wish to secure the Vance legacy, you will look into Julian's true finances, you will protect Thomas, and you will stop treating your daughter as a line item in a ledger." The silence in the study was absolute. The Earl stared at the letter, then slowly raised his eyes to his daughter. For the first time in her life, Seraphina saw not a patri, but a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor. The power dynamic in the room had violently inverted. He had expected a weeping, obedient girl. He had received a queen. "You have changed, Seraph," he murmured, his voice laced with a dangerous curiosity. "I have awake, father," she corrected softly. "I suggest you do the same, before it is too late." She did not wait for his permission to leave. She turned and walked out of the study, leaving him sitting alone in the candlelight, staring at the closed door. The first pillar of her prison had been struck with a hammer. But as she ascended the grand staircase to her bedchamber, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a cold, knowing dread. She had won the battle with her father, but Julian was a different kind of enemy. He was not bound by blood or honor. He was bound only by ambition, and he would not tolerate her defiance. She entered her bedchamber, the familiar scent of lavender and rosewater doing nothing to soothe her racing heart. The room was dire, the moonlight casting long, pale rectangles across the floor. She moved toward her vanity to unpin her hair. Her reflection in the mirror looking back at her with eyes that were far too old for her face. "You are much bolder than I was led to believe, Lady Seraphina." The voice came from the recess corner of the room, near the velvet-draped window. It was smooth cultured, and utterly chilling. Seraphina froze. Her hand instinctively flew to the small, concealed dagger she had slipped into her bodice before leaving the ballroom. She turned slow, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, dressed in the arrayed clothing of a rogue or an assassin. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but the moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw and the cold, metallic glint of a blade resting casually against his thigh. He was not one of Julian's household gods. He was an outsider, a professional. "Lord Julian sends his regards," the man murmured, his voice a soft, lethal purr as he took a slow step toward her. He was quite distressed by your performance tonight. He believes you have become a liability to his grand design. He has authorized me to ensure that your tragic, fragile constitution finally gives way. Serafina's mind raced. Julian had moved faster than she anticipated. He had not waited for her to return to the manor. He had sent a killer to intercept her, intending to stage her death as a sudden illness or an accident. In her path, she had died of a broken heart. In this life, they intended to give her a broken neck, but as the assassin closed the distance, raising the blade with practiced, silent efficiency, Serafina did not scream. She did not cower. The fear that had paralyzed her in her past life was gone. Burned away by the inferno of her rebirth, she was no longer the helpless victim waiting in the dark. She tightened her grip on the hidden dagger in her bodice, her eyes locking onto the assassins with a fierce, predatory, "Tell Julian," Serafina whispered, her voice as sharp and cold as the steel in her hand, "that his design is flawed." The assassin lunged, the blade slicing through the moonlit air, but Serafina was already moving, the shadows of the bedchamber wrapping around her like a second skin. The hunt was no longer one-sided. The prey had just drawn blood. The blade sliced through the moonlit air, a silver RC aimed precisely at her throat. But Serafina was no longer the woman who had stood frozen on that eastern balcony 3 years ago. She had anticipated the strike, her body moving with a lethal grace born of pure survival instinct. She dropped low, the assassin's knife whistling harmlessly over her head, and drove the concealed dagger from her bodice upward into the soft flesh beneath his ribs. The man gasped a wet rag sound, as the steel found its mare. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock as he stared down at the hilt protruding from his chest. He had expected he had expected a screaming victim. He had not expected the Duchess to fight back with the precision of an executioner. Serafina did not hesitate. She twisted the blade, severing the vital artery, and withdrew it in one fluid motion. The assassin collapsed onto the plush rug, his lifeblood pooling directly in the silver moonlight. Within moments, his chest stopped moving. The silence rushed back into the room, heavier than before, thick with the metallic tang of death. Serafina stood over him, her breathing steady, her hands remarkably still. She wiped the blade on his dark tunic and slipped it back into its sheath. She did not feel the crushing guilt or the paralyzing terror that the old Serafina would have felt. She felt only the cold, crystalline clarity of a woman who had finally taken control of her own fate. Julian had sent a message, she had sent one back. The rest of the night passed in a blur of calculated efficiency. Serafina did not call the Graz. She did not wake the servants. Instead, she dragged the body to the hidden servants' passage behind the wardrobe. A route she had discovered in her past life, when she used to sneak out to meet Julian in secret. Now it served a far more practical purpose. By dawn the body was gone, disposed of in the deep, churning waters of the river gorge where no one would ever find it. When the sun rose, casting a pale gold light over Vance Manor, Serafina sat at her vanity, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate stroke. Her reflection stared back at her, calm and resolute. The girl who had died on a bed of silk and regret was truly gone. In her place sat a woman forged in the fires of betrayal. The true reckoning came 3 days later, at the grand midsummer masquerade. The ballroom was a sea of swirling silks and painted masks, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and perfume. Julian was there, looking every inch the triumphant lord, his smile fixed and confident. He believed she was dead, or at least broken beyond repair. When he saw her glide into the hall, wearing a mask of black lace and a gown the color of fresh blood, his smile faltered. He approached her, his eyes rotting frantically around the room, reaching for the assassin's confirmation. Sarah breathed, his voice tight with panic. "I am always here," she murmured, her voice a silken whisper meant only for him. "Just as I always will be." She took his arm, leading him away from the prying eyes of the court, guiding him toward the familiar, secluded shadows of the eastern balcony. The very spot where he had once whispered his treason, the very spot where he had planned her demise. "What did you do?" he hissed the moment they were alone, his hands gripping her arms in a bruising hold. "Where is he? What have you done to him?" Serafina did not flinch. She simply reached up and untied the black lace mask, letting it fall to the stone balustrade. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the cold, distant stars. "He was very clumsy, my love," she whispered, her tone dripping with a terrifying sweetness. "He lacked your finesse. But then, you always did prefer to let others do your dirty work while you played the noble husband." As Julian's face drained of color, the realization hit him like a physical blow. "You killed him. I removed a liability," she corrected softly, "just as you intended to remove me." Before he could speak, the terrace doors opened. Prince Callan stepped out into the night air, his presence commanding and absolute. Behind him stood two royal gras, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords, and beside the prince stood Earl Vance, his face a mask of grim, horrified realization as he looked at his son-in-law. Seraphina had not acted alone. She had used the assassin's attempt on her life as the ultimate proof of Julian's treason, delivering the evidence directly to the prince and her father in the dead of night. She had secured her brother's safety, her family's assets, and her own freedom in one masterful stroke. Lord Julian Thorne. Prince Callan's voice boomed across the quiet balcony, echoing off the stone walls. You are under arrest for high treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and treason against the crown. Julian stared at Seraphina, his eyes wide with a dawning absolute. He looked at her not as a wife, but as the architect of his destruction. You planned this from the beginning? No, Julian. Seraphina replied, her voice a soft, devastating whisper as the Gaillard stepped forward to bind his hands in iron. I planned this from the moment you asked me to bury you with my sister. I merely decided to bury you first. As they dragged him away, his cries of denial echoing into the night, Seraphina remained on the balcony. The cold wind whipped her crimson skirts around her ankles, but she felt no chill beside her. Prince Callan stood in silent solidarity, his presence a steady, unyielding anchor in the storm she had unleashed. She looked out over the sprawling Girardins below, the moonlight casting long, silver shadows across the estate. The nightmare was over, the cage was broken. Seraphina reached down and picked up the black lace mask from the balustrade. She ran her thumb over the delicate fabric, feeling the weight of the life she had left behind. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her hand and let the mask fall. It tumbled over the edge, disappearing into the endless, swallowing darkness below. She did not watch it land. She simply turned away from the ledge, her head held high, and walked back toward the light. The ashes of her past had been scattered to the wind, and from them a queen had finally risen.